So, why did the USA get increasingly involved in Vietnam? Firstly, the domino theory. The domino theory was a massive reason for the US involvement in Vietnam due to China becoming a communist nation in 1949. The US feared that if another country in Asia was to become communist, it could lead to the whole of Asia becoming communist due to the domino effect. The US knew if South Vietnam fell, then Asia could succumb to communism. Also, the South Vietnamese soldiers. The USA felt obliged to enter the war due to the inabilities of the South Vietnamese army. The soldiers were poorly trained and even killed in their defensive positions while they slept. The NVA, meanwhile, were very good at guerrilla warfare and tactically brilliant. Containment also was a reason why the US got involved, because this was their policy on why they stopped communism and how they did it, and they felt that they needed to stop communism spreading to South Vietnam. Finally, retaliation. The US was subjected to an attack from North Vietnam before they entered the war. In February 1965, the US soldiers and air bases were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Overall, I believe that containment was the main reason for the US involvement in Vietnam. At the time, fears of communism spreading worldwide were very high, and this massively influenced their decision.
Why did the US struggle militarily? Viet Cong tactics were called guerrilla tactics, which was ambushing US patrols, setting booby traps and hiding bombs in the path of US soldiers. They would hide in tunnels and ambush soldiers. They would hide in civilian clothes and in towns, or they would hide near the US so they couldn't be bombed. They were supplied by China and Russia because they wanted to keep communism alive. The US fought a very high-tech war using things like bombs and napalm, which is all good, but the US couldn't find them, so their high-tech weapons weren't really useful. But when they did find them, it caused a lot of collateral damage, so it lowered the soldiers' morale. The tactics were to bomb out the Viet Cong and use search and destroy parties, which were, as they called, looking for Charlie, which was the enemy. Russia and China both aided Vietnam by giving them explosive like bombs, landmines, and they aided them because they wanted to keep the communism alive in other countries. Russia's military supplied 2,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery guns and over 5,000 anti-aircraft guns, and a lot of ammunition to the Viet Cong soldiers. The most significant reason that the US military struggled was because Vietnam fought a very guerrilla war. They used their homeland to their advantage and the US couldn't break the Vietnamese tactics. The Vietnamese were hidden and so forth they outsmarted the US soldiers.
Talking about why the Vietnam War was so unpopular, and we're discussing the military defeat, media coverage, and protest movement as the reasons. I'm going to start with military defeat. The military was not as organised as powerful as they hoped. Troops were demoralised and didn't know what they were fighting for. The guerrilla tactics dispirited troops, and many of them took drugs and shot officers. This brought corruption from some of the military, and this made some of the troops not fit to fight. The My Lai massacre shocked and appalled the American troops and officers. This could be seen as a sign of revenge, but it's not a very moral thing to do. 58,000 young troops were killed fighting 8,000 miles away from home. The South Vietnamese regime was weak, brutal and corrupt. The South Vietnamese reacted by hiding from the Viet Cong, which weakened their offensive. The evidence, I will now talk about the media coverage. During the Vietnam War, media coverage demoralised the public at home, showing failures, atrocities and horrors. Extensive media coverage meant that Americans witnessed military failures and atrocities in their own homes. This made people at home lose support for the war and will lead to demoralisation. Media coverage undermined the political effort and the military, which made people less likely to join the war. The Tet Offensive caused a heavy loss of lives, which lowered the morale of other soldiers and people at home. The media coverage showed the people at home all these tragedies. I'm now going to talk about protest movement. Black Americans opposed the war as they could not avoid the draft and were twice as likely to be killed as the white American. African American soldiers were fighting in integrated platoons for the first time and were experiencing racial abuse by other soldiers. This made African American people less willing to go to war in Vietnam. Rumours spread that the US was using Vietnam as a genocide. It was using genocide to kill off African Americans by forcing many to enlist, which made African Americans dislike the country itself and potentially forced them to protest. African Americans didn't have very good lifestyles. However, the £950 billion spent on the war annoyed the African Americans, as this money could have been spent on improving lifestyles, not killing people. If some money was spent on their living conditions, it made them persuade them to join the war. My overall judgment, I think that the military defeat was the most significant reason for the war being the most popular reason. This is because the South Vietnamese outsmarted the Americans and countered their large firepower. The guerrilla tactics allowed the Vietnamese to protect themselves from the napalm powerful forces. The American tactics were not suitable for the Vietnamese as they did not seriously affect them without affecting their own soldiers, which allowed them to preserve soldiers and keep close to the enemy at the same time. The soldiers were often demoralised, quick drugged and shot officers, which brought the the army. Although However, the civil rights movement was very important in my opinion. It linked in with the military folks. This is because the military themselves were not racially discriminated. The African Americans, then this would create more of a reason for them to join the army. The media coverage also took a large role in the Vietnam War, as it decreased the amount of soldiers signing up for the war. As all that was shown was the atrocities and failures and horrors, which decreased support for the war and was to stop. If there weren't as many defeats in the Vietnam War, and this wouldn't have been shown on the media coverage, then the media coverage would not have been to blame. And that's my
Boom!
conclusion.
Hi, I didn't see you there. I'll be talking about why the Americans left the Vietnam War. So, there's four main factors that we need to think about. The first is failed tactics. America withdrew from the Vietnam War due to their failed tactics in the field, at least it was a factor involved. Firstly, the tactics the US used were very controversial, for example napalm being used, that caused a lot of agony and pain. And also, the US were not suited to the terrain in the jungle, as most soldiers were big and strong rather than small and sneaky like the Vietnamese soldiers. And one tactic that was really useful and successful that the Vietnamese used were guerrilla tactics. Why were they useful? Why do you think? Well, if you can't see your enemy,
don't ask me.
if you can't see your enemy, how can you beat them? And that brings up an interesting question, because they ended up digging holes so they wouldn't even know where they'd go. So imagine trench warfare, but you just can't enter the trenches. Imagine what that's like. So many soldiers were dying, and that caused unrest back at home. So the US struggled with the guerrilla warfare used by the Viet Cong, and the idea of the NVA having no permanent base, so it could not be bombed as it was always moving. Finally, the Vietnamese had a better knowledge of the areas that they fought in, and on many occasions it appeared to be the downfall, as the Viet Cong would hide in defensive positions, waiting for the US soldiers to walk into their traps and gunfire. The US may have had far superior munitions, but they couldn't actually use them when they were hugging the wall and when the Vietnamese soldiers were so close to the American soldiers. Next, I'll be talking about new interests. America's interests changed throughout the war. So by the end of the war, the sole interest was not to win the war, but instead it was to end the war. And that's a huge change. Okay, so the US went to big measures in order to end the war by introducing Vietnamization. What's Vietnamization? It's a big word. It's like militarization, but not. Well, it kind of is. Because it's militarizing Vietnam people. Why? Because it decreases the dependency for American soldiers. So the US also had their interest diverted away from the war due to the breakdown in relations between China and the USSR, from both nations trying to make the US its ally so they weren't outnumbered. Now we were talking about domestic oppositions. Now what does that mean? Well, let's think about them. The domestic opposition to the Vietnam War was another large reason for the withdrawal from Vietnam. Many US students protested against the war, and also the use of napalm, which I was talking about earlier. So, many black Americans opposed the war, as they were twice as likely to be drafted than a white person due to their race, because of the segregation at the time. So really, if they've got this internal conflict that they've got in America, so why do they need to go all the way to list conflicts in Asia to fight for a war? Makes no sense. Oh, But many high-profile... Exactly, they didn't. Because many high-profile
I'm the
figures
cameraman.
didn't. Such as Muhammad Ali and Martin Luther King.
I wrote
They
this.
openly protested against the war. So with many of these protests being staged against the war, this even included the burning of the American flag, a crime that could get you put in prison. So in 1969, the largest political protest in America was staged against the war with 700,000 people protesting. That's quite a lot of people when you think about it. Finally, the students protesting in particular raised fears in the government because you've got this whole generation that are alienated, and that's really bad news for the government. Also, the financial cost of the war. Yes, it's more high tech, but guess what? It costs a lot of money. Do you know how much it costs? Give me an estimate.
I reckon it cost
Billion.
280 billion. No, 140 billion US dollars.
Boom,
I
boom,
did it.
boom. So he knows his stuff, this guy.
No, I wrote the sheet.
Yeah. So throughout the war, the US spent it. So this was a lot of money.
It's going to have to be, otherwise
So
I'll have to
the
go
war was
back
also
and clear part of this now.
the war was also caused an economic plague. Why did it cause a plague? Not a bubonic plague or a pneumonic plague, an economic plague. Why? Because the business as factories creating consumer goods were replaced with ones for producing military equipment and created a slump in the US economy. Right, hang on, right. So now we know, okay, America's a superpower, but the Vietnam's only like a small country. So what does it matter? So we come down to our conclusion. Because on paper, I even say on paper, it looks like the Vietnam War was easily winnable. I mean, a superpower against Vietnam, against an army who used guerrilla tactics and spike traps, seriously? So the thing is, the US could have won the Vietnam War, but their intentions were to end it as soon as possible. So the war would have been a hollow victory, and the most important factor was domestic opposition. It meant that people were against the war, and this was very dangerous for a government that was built upon democracy. Thank you, peace out, and I'll answer.
And now I'll put the explosion in, okay?